Hello and welcome to How to Go to Therapy, a YouTube channel, all about the ins and outs of how to go to therapy. Today we're going to talk about, I'm not a therapist. Look down below if you'd like to see a little bit more of my professional and personal experience in the mental health community. Today I want to talk about how to find a good therapist and some questions that you can ask when you're interviewing a new therapist. A lot of people don't realize that you can call 3 different therapists within the same week and ask a few questions and do a phone consult or send an email or something like that, and then decide from there who you want to go see. Because sometimes if it matches up with your insurance and stuff like that, if you have insurance, or sometimes if they do consultations, however the process works, sometimes you can even for a reasonable rate, or sometimes, like I said, free consultations, you can get to know a couple of different therapists in a certain kind of way without having to commit I will be seeing you until I'm 97. And so I think that's something good to know, because therapists know. They know that people want to be in an environment that makes sense for them, and therapists want to be in an environment that makes sense for them too. Of course, it's not all about the therapist, but you don't want to be matched up with someone and it doesn't work out, and then both of you guys are just sitting there knowing it's not the right vibe, but you're doing it anyway. You're well, we have to commit to each other. That's not how it works, and a good therapist doesn't want that for you or themselves. And so I came up with 3 questions that you can ask a therapist, either on a phone consult or via email, or even at a first session. You don't have to sit down at your first session and tell your life story. If you do, it happens, okay, fine, but you don't have to do that. So these are 4 questions. The first one is kind of you don't have to ask, but it's sometimes, if you're a logistical person like me, you kind of want to know, so where'd you get your degree from? So why are you a therapist anyway? I like to ask that question, but you don't have to ask that. I'm just nosy. The second question would be, have you ever, and then have you ever dealt with someone who, or have you ever counseled someone who, and then say something short and sweet about yourself, right? So for me, I would say, have you ever counseled someone that is a new mom living in a new place? Or you could say, have you ever counseled someone that has, recently relocated because of their job? I talk a lot about moving because I live in a new state, so it's just fresh on my mind. But that's just a really short and sweet thing that you can ask, because a lot of times that can give a therapist an open door to let you know, you're safe here. I understand what you're going through. I've communicated with people that are going through similar things. I've counseled people that are going through similar things. And it can help you gauge your compatibility and see if you think that you'd like to move forward with this person being your counselor. If you have follow-up questions after they answer, then you can ask those too. The second question would be asking them, that's my pen, would be asking them if it's okay that you don't always know what to say. Now, this might not be a phone consultation question or an email question. This might be more of a first or second session question. But yes, talking in therapy is a good idea, but sometimes you might feel overwhelmed by life and you don't have a lot to say. I had a therapist once, and I only saw this therapist once because I did not feel like it was a good fit, where I didn't know what to say because I was having a really rough day, and the therapist did not know what to do with that. I, to this day, am frustrated by that situation, because a therapist should always have something to say. Now, sometimes a therapist will be silent in a session, and that's okay. But what I mean is that if you come into a session and you're just I don't have a lot on my mind today, a good therapist should be able to say, let's talk about last Sunday night. What'd you do? Have you seen the new Spider-Man movie? Or something. There should always be something that can be talked about, unless you're I don't want to hear you talk. A therapist should not be ending a session early. on account of silence on the other end of the room, because that's not how a therapist operates. So, in my opinion. So I do think that you should ask a therapist maybe in the first session, like, hey, is it okay if sometimes like I don't have a ton to say, like, will you have something to talk about? And I know for a fact my therapist today, if I were to go to her and I was like, hey, XYZ is stressing me out, I can promise you her response would be, so we can talk about X, we can talk about Y, we can talk about Z, or I have some other things that we haven't gotten to talk about yet. Like, I know for a fact that's what she would say. And to me, that is a one of many signs of a good therapist. And the third question that is good to ask, either via email, phone consultation, or first session, is about payment and their cancellation policy. Sometimes it gets a little awkward because you can start to feel like your therapist is your friend. You can start to feel really connected to them. That's a whole nother video. But then you get to that point where you have to like pay, and then you're like, oh, this is awkward. My therapist right now is on auto pay, and I really like that because I feel really blessed because our insurance really covers it right now, and so it's very affordable, and so I don't really have to think about it. But in the past, like pulling that card out can just be like, oh, and I'm paying for friendship. It's okay, like therapy costs money. It should be free. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, so I would just make sure you ask about that. Like, hey, what is the payment like? Is it, if it's auto pay, is it going to be every single week? What's your cancellation policy? And just making sure that you kind of know what's going on ahead of time. Any question that you ask a therapist, any question that you ask a therapist while you're interviewing them, auditioning them, whatever word we want to call it, whatever their answer is, you'll know if it's someone that you want to have another session with, if you still feel comfortable. You know, sometimes our therapists, the way they answer questions might make us feel a little awkward or nervous, maybe even a little insecure, on account of ourselves, not on account of them. I remember the first time I found out that my therapist could not be my Facebook friend. I was 19 and I wanted to crawl under the entire city of Atlanta. I was so embarrassed. I remember the first time I found out that I could not buy my therapist a Christmas present. I was so embarrassed. I walked out the door and I was like, I will just see you next week. Those things can happen, but I can promise you at the same time, even though I felt a little embarrassed, I still felt comfortable with that person. And so even if you ask your therapist a question like, well, where'd you go to college? Why'd you get into therapy? Have you ever talked to somebody like me? If they get to a point where they say, hey, let's talk a little bit more about you than me, or hey, let's, if they respond in a way that you're just like, oh, I feel awkward, I feel stressed out now. As long as you still feel comfortable, as long as you still feel supported, as long as you can see their intention, it's a safe bet to say that this is someone that you could do another session with, a second or third session with. And therapy is not supposed to be a place where you feel giggly butterflies 24/7. There are going to be moments where you might feel, oh, I need to change, or maybe I shouldn't say that again, or that question might have been too personal for a therapy session for me to ask my therapist. But hopefully they're able to respond and share and answer your questions in a way that makes you still feel comfortable, makes you feel safe, and makes you feel supported, because those are the most important things. The next video that I do, I want to talk about how to break up with your therapist, because in the event you don't feel comfortable, safe, or supported, you should break up with your therapist. And then also, so I'm going to do another video on that, so be sure to subscribe. I lost my other shoe. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos on how to go to therapy.